A woman's scream tore through the frozen night, swallowed by a blizzard that buried all hope. Was she alone, or was something stalking her in the dark? Inside a rotting cabin, barely standing against the wind's fury, Jasmine Blackwell knelt by a dying fire, her body trembling. Her hands cradled her swollen belly, heavy with twins, her breath fogging in the icy air. The walls groaned, cold seeping through cracks like a silent predator. Embers flickered weakly, casting shadows that seemed to whisper threats. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood, stale wool, and the faint rot of a roof that had leaked for weeks. Far off, a wolf's howl cut through the silence, sharp and lonely, before the quiet returned, heavy as the snow piling against the door. 7 days ago, Rafe had abandoned her. He'd slung the rifle over his shoulder, grabbed the mule, and snatched the last crust of bread from a shelf. "I ain't hauling a cow through this hell," he'd snarled, his boots crunching into the drifts as he stormed off. Jasmine had pleaded, her voice cracking, her hands reaching for him, begging him to stay until the twins came. He hadn't even turned, his figure swallowed by the storm, leaving her with nothing but the echo of his cruelty. Now, alone, with the wind rattling the windows, her chest felt like it held a boulder, crushing her breath. She pressed her lips to her belly and whispered, "We're tougher than this, my girls. We'll survive." The twins stirred, faint kicks, but her heart stuttered, weak from hunger and cold. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of vanishing, of her daughters never knowing her touch. Years ago, she'd buried a stillborn, a tiny life that never breathed, and the memory of that silence clung to her, sharp as ice. Her fingers, raw and cracked, clutched a tattered quilt that barely warmed her. Her boots were black with soot, her nails split from scraping kindling off the floor. She rose, wincing, her back screaming from nights on the hardwood, her swollen belly making every move a battle. Gripping a wobbly chair, she steadied herself as the room spun, her vision blurring, her legs trembling from weeks of barely eating. She'd rationed the last of the oats, a handful a day, her stomach gnawing itself empty to keep the twins alive. She needed water, Snow would have to do. Shuffling to the door, her swollen legs aching, she yanked it open. The wind hit her like a slap, stealing her breath, snow swirling past her knees in heavy drifts. She scooped some into a dented tin pail, her hands burning with cold, the skin splitting at her knuckles, blood mixing with the snow. As she turned back, a shadow flickered at the edge of the woods, tall, human, gone in a blink. Her heart leapt. "Rafe?" she whispered, squinting into the white, her voice lost in the storm. Nothing moved, but a faint crunch echoed, like a footstep muffled by snow. Fear clawed at her chest. She stumbled inside, slamming the door, her pulse racing, the pail shaking in her hands, water sloshing onto the floor. She set it by the fire, her fingers trembling so hard she nearly dropped it. Then pain struck, sharp and deep, like a blade twisting in her belly, fiercer than anything she'd felt. She gasped, collapsing to her knees, the pail tipping, snow spilling across the floorboards. Another pain came, relentless, stealing her air, her body shaking as the twins pressed against her. She clawed at the wood, her mother's voice echoing. "You don't break when you're hurt, Maggie girl. You break when you stop fighting." Jasmine choked out a bitter laugh, then sobbed as the pain surged again, her vision pulsing, her body screaming for rest she couldn't afford. She'd survived starvation, cold, Rafe's betrayal. She wouldn't give up now. She crawled toward the door, fingers grazing the frame, desperate to bar it against whatever lurked outside, but her strength failed. She slumped, her cheek pressed to the icy floor, the world dimming. "Please," she breathed, her voice a whisper, "let me hold them once." The storm offered no answer, but outside, something moved, closer, deliberate, the snow crunching under heavy steps. Calvin Brewster rode through the blizzard, his mare trudging through deep drifts, her breath misting in the air. A doctor, he carried bandages, dried meat, and blankets in his creaking buckboard, his hands steady despite the cold biting his fingers. He wasn't due back in town for days, but a strange pull tugged at him, like a voice in the wind he couldn't ignore. The storm was thick, the world a white void, but he swore he heard a cry. Faint, human, desperate. He scanned the expanse, his eyes straining, then froze. A figure lay in the drifts, half buried, barely a shape. Not a log, a woman. He leapt down, stumbling knee-deep through the snow, his heart pounding. Her lips were blue, her hands bare, her belly massive, heavy with child. Twins, he realized, feeling the faint movements. Her pulse was weak, thready, but there. The twins moved faintly beneath her shawl. "Stay with me," he muttered, lifting her carefully, his arms strong but gentle, her weight heavy with the life she carried. "You're not done yet." The cabin was steps away, its outline faint through the storm. He kicked the door open, laid her by the hearth, and barred the wind outside. The room was frigid, the fire dead, the air biting his skin. He piled kindling, coaxing flames to life with quick, practiced hands, the glow pushing back the dark. Stripping her soaked clothes, he wrapped her in blankets, his movements careful, respectful, mindful of her condition. Boiling snow in a pot, he pressed a warm cloth to her lips, watching her chest rise and fall, her breath shallow but stubborn. Her pulse steadied, as did the twins, faint but fighting. Calvin sat back, brushing snow from his beard, his breath slowing. "You're all fighters," he said softly, his voice low in the quiet, his eyes tracing her face, pale but fierce. As the fire grew, Jasmine stirred, her eyes fluttering open, glassy with pain and confusion. "Where?" she rasped, her voice thin, barely audible. "Your cabin," Calvin said, his tone calm, grounding. "I'm Dr. Brewster. I found you just in time." Her hands flew to her belly, panic flashing in her eyes, her fingers pressing against the twins. "My baby's alive," he said, his voice steady, his hand gently guiding hers to feel their faint kicks. "All three of you are." Tears spilled down her cheeks, silent and heavy, her body trembling with relief. She turned her face to the wall, clutching the quilt, her breaths ragged. Calvin didn't push, didn't ask questions. He brewed weak tea, set a chipped cup beside her, and cleaned his hands by the fire, the crackle of wood filling the silence. The wind howled outside, but he felt watched, a prickling at his neck that wouldn't fade. Stepping to the window, he peered into the storm. The snow held faint tracks, barely visible, human-shaped, leading toward the woods. Who had left her here, and why were they still circling? Days passed, slow and grueling, but Jasmine fought to grow stronger, her cheeks regaining a hint of color despite the hunger that still gnawed at her. She'd survived on scraps for weeks, her body weak but unyielding, every ounce of strength poured into keeping the twins alive. Calvin stayed, his presence quiet but constant, a lifeline she clung to. He mended the hearth, piling stones to trap the heat, and boarded up a broken window with planks from a fallen shelf. He carved a cradle from an old crate, sanding the wood until it was smooth, big enough for two tiny lives. He cooked simple meals, oats warmed with dried apples, a strip of bacon when her stomach could handle it, the smoky smell a faint comfort in the cold. The twins' heartbeats grew steadier, a soft double rhythm checked daily with Calvin's stethoscope. Their kicks stronger, a promise of life. Jasmine watched him work, her eyes tracing his steady hands, the lines around his eyes, the way he moved with purpose but never haste. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his words were kind, never pitying, and she felt seen, not as a burden, but as a woman who'd fought to survive. The cabin felt uneasy, like it held its breath. At night, Jasmine heard scratches on the walls, too rhythmic for wind, too deliberate for branches. She'd wake, heart racing, staring into the dark, the fire's glow casting long shadows that seemed to move. Calvin checked the snow each morning, his boots crunching outside, but found no clear tracks, only faint disturbances, like someone had swept their steps away. "Wolves, maybe," he said, but his hand rested on the knife at his belt, his eyes scanning the woods, wary. One morning, Jasmine found a mark on the doorframe, a jagged scratch, etched with a blade, deep enough to splinter the wood. "Calvin," she called, her voice tight, her fingers tracing the mark, her heart pounding. He studied it, his brow furrowing, his jaw tight. "Not an animal," he said. "Someone's been here." Her stomach twisted, fear curling inside her, her hands pressing against her belly. "Rafe?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Calvin shook his head, his eyes dark. "Can't be sure, but we're safe." She wanted to believe him, but the mark felt like a threat, cold and personal, a reminder of the man who'd left her to die. That night, a heavy thud echoed outside, like a log dropped in the snow, deliberate and close. Jasmine froze, her breath catching, her hands tightening around the quilt. Calvin was already up, grabbing his lantern, his knife gleaming in the firelight. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice low, urgent. He slipped into the dark, the door creaking shut behind him. Jasmine sat, her heart pounding, counting the seconds in her head, her eyes fixed on the door. The silence stretched, heavy, broken only by the fire's soft crackle and the wind's low moan. Minutes passed, each one heavier, her mind racing. Had Ray found them? Was he out there, waiting, his blade ready? When Calvin returned, his face was grim, snow clinging to his coat, his breath quick. "Nothing," he said, but his eyes flicked to the window, searching the dark. Just the storm. Later, he found a scrap of red cloth snagged on a nail outside. Torn, faded, like Rafe's old shirt. "He's out there," Jasmine whispered, her voice shaking, her hands trembling as she clutched the quilt. Calvin's jaw clenched, his fingers gripping the knife. "If he comes, he won't get past me," he said, his tone hard, protective. She nodded, but fear lingered, a shadow that followed her even in the daylight, creeping into her dreams. The next day, Jasmine sat by the fire, stitching a small blanket for the twins, her needle moving slowly, her hands weak but determined. She'd survived starvation, cold, Rafe's betrayal. Each stitch was a small act of defiance, a promise to her daughters. Calvin chopped wood outside, his axe ringing in the cold air, the sound steady, grounding. She watched him through the window, his breath misting, his shoulders broad under his coat. He was older than Rafe, his face lined with years and loss, but his eyes held a kindness Rafe never had, a strength that didn't need to shout. She wondered about him, who he was before, what kept him here, why he stayed for her. When he came inside, snow dusting his hair, she offered him a cup of tea, her fingers brushing his as she handed it over. "You don't have to do all this," she said, her voice soft, her eyes searching his. He took the cup, his eyes meeting hers, warm but guarded. "I know," he said, "but you're worth it." Her throat tightened, and she looked away, afraid of the warmth in his voice, afraid of what it stirred in her, a hope she hadn't dared feel in years. Another night brought more scratches, louder, closer to the door, like nails dragging across wood. Jasmine woke, her heart racing, the sound pulling her from a dream of her mother's voice, warm and far away. She sat up, staring into the dark, the fire's glow barely reaching the corners of the room. Calvin was already awake, standing by the window, his silhouette sharp against the frosted glass. "You heard it too?" she whispered, her voice trembling, her hands clutching the quilt. He nodded, lantern in hand, his knife tucked into his belt. "Stay with the fire," he said, his tone calm but firm. He stepped outside, the cold rushing in as the door opened, then closed with a soft thud. Jasmine pulled the quilt tighter, her eyes fixed on the window, her breath shallow. The minutes dragged, each one heavy with dread. She imagined Rafe out there, his eyes wild, his blade gleaming, circling the cabin like a wolf. When Calvin returned, his breath was quick, his knife still drawn, snow melting on his boots. "No one," he said, but his voice was tight, his eyes troubled. "Just more marks." He showed her the door, 3 new scratches, deeper, forming a crude triangle, like a symbol meant to unnerve. "He's taunting us," Jasmine said, her voice shaking, her hands clenching the quilt. Calvin barred the door, his movements deliberate, his jaw tight. "He can try," he said. "He won't win." The next morning, Jasmine found another mark, a crude drawing of a hand, fingers splayed, scratched into the door with a knife's point. Her stomach churned, the image burning into her mind, her hands trembling as she traced it. "He's closer," she said, showing Calvin, her voice barely above a whisper. He studied it, his jaw tight, his fingers tracing the splintered wood. "He's trying to scare us," he said, his tone hard, his eyes dark with resolve. "It's working," she admitted, her hands shaking, her eyes darting to the windows, fear wrapping around her heart. Calvin touched her shoulder, his hands steady, warm. "He can't touch you," he said. "Not while I'm here." She wanted to believe him, but the drawing felt like a promise, like Rafe knew her fears, her weaknesses, and was carving them into the wood to break her. Jasmine began keeping a small knife under her pillow, its handle worn but solid, a secret she didn't share with Calvin. She'd survived too much, hunger, cold, betrayal, to let Rafe take her daughters now. She practiced holding it, her fingers learning its weight, her hands steadying with each day, her resolve hardening. During the day, she walked the cabin's small space, her legs gaining strength, her body remembering how to fight despite the weight of the twins. She sang to them, soft lullabies her mother once sang, the words coming back like old friends, her voice trembling but strong. Calvin listened sometimes, sitting by the fire, his eyes soft as she sang, his presence a quiet comfort. "You've got a good voice," he said once, his tone gentle, warm. She blushed, shaking her head, her cheeks warm. "It's just for them," she said, but the compliment lingered, a small light in the dark. Another night brought a new sound. Not scratches, but a low, rhythmic tapping like a stick against the wall, steady and deliberate. Jasmine woke, her heart racing, the sound pulling her from a dream of open fields and sunlight. She sat up, clutching the quilt, her breath shallow, the twins stirring faintly inside her. Calvin was already by the door, lantern in hand, his knife tucked into his belt. "Stay there," he said, his voice low, urgent. He stepped outside, the cold rushing in, the door creaking shut. Jasmine held her breath, her eyes fixed on the window, the glass frosted at the edges, her mind racing. The tapping stopped, but the silence was worse, heavy with dread. She imagined Rafe out there, his eyes wild, his blade ready, waiting for a moment to strike. When Calvin returned, his face was pale, his breath quick, his hand trembling as he barred the door. "No one," he said, but his voice was tight, his eyes troubled. "Just more marks." He showed her, a cluster of scratches, forming a rough circle, like a brand, carved into the wood. "He's playing with us," Jasmine said, her voice shaking, her fingers tightening around the quilt. Calvin sat beside her, his presence steadying, his hand resting near hers. "He can play," he said. "He won't win." The next day, Jasmine sat by the fire, her notebook open, a small gift from her mother hidden under a floorboard. She wrote to her twins, names like Clara and Rose, dreams of teaching them to braid flowers, to read by candlelight, to stand tall like she was learning to do. She'd survived so much, weeks of hunger, her body wasting to keep them alive, nights of cold that numbed her bones, Rafe's betrayal that cut deeper than any knife. Each word she wrote was a vow, a promise to be the mother they deserved. Calvin watched her sometimes, his eyes soft, and she felt seen, not as a victim, but as a woman who'd fought and won again and again. She showed him one entry, her handwriting small but steady. "You are my strength, my fight, my home." He read it silently, his fingers tracing the words, his face soft, unguarded. "They're lucky to have you," he said, his voice low, warm. Jasmine smiled, her heart full, heavy with love. "We're lucky to have you," she said, her voice soft but sure. And for the first time, she believed it. The pains began one night, sharp and rhythmic, pulling Jasmine from a restless sleep, fiercer than she'd expected, like her body was splitting to bring the twins into the world. She gasped, gripping the bed frame, sweat beading on her brow despite the cold, her hands clutching her belly as the pains came faster, harder. "It's time," she said, fear and certainty mixing in her voice, her body trembling with the effort of survival. Calvin nodded, his calm a shield against her panic, his eyes steady, focused. He moved the bed closer to the fire, its warmth spreading through the room, and boiled water in a pot, the steam rising in soft curls. He laid out clean cloths, his movements precise, practiced, his hands steady despite the urgency. "You're strong," he said, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, his touch gentle, grounding. "You'll do this." She clenched her teeth as a contraction hit, her nails digging into the blanket, her breath hitching, her body screaming. "Don't let us die," she whispered, her voice breaking, her eyes searching his, fear for her twins overwhelming her. "You won't," he said, his gaze unwavering, his voice a rock. "I'm right here." Hours blurred into a haze of pain and heat, each contraction a wave crashing over her, relentless, testing the strength she'd built through weeks of survival. Jasmine screamed, then breathed, then pushed, her body trembling, her hands clawing at the sheets, her heart pounding with the will to bring her daughters into the world. She'd survive hunger, cold, Rafe, she could survive this. Calvin stayed close, his voice a lifeline, guiding her through each surge, his hand on hers, his thumb brushing her knuckles. "You're doing fine," he said, his voice low, steady. "Keep going." She locked eyes with him, saw no doubt, only belief. It gave her strength, a fire that burned through the pain. "One more," he said, his voice urgent, his eyes locked on hers. "You're there." She bore down, a raw cry tearing from her throat, her body giving everything. Silence fell, heavy and still, then a wail, sharp, alive, followed by another, softer but fierce. Calvin lifted the twins, two girls, wrapped in soft linen, their tiny bodies warm and squirming, their cries a song of survival. "They're perfect," he said, tears glinting in his eyes, his voice thick with awe, his hands trembling as he handed them to her. Jasmine sobbed, reaching for them, her chest heaving with relief and love, her fingers trembling as she touched their soft cheeks. "You're real," she whispered, cradling Clara and Rose, her daughters, her fighters. "You're mine," she said, her voice breaking, her heart full. "You did this," Calvin said, his voice soft, reverent, his eyes shining with pride. They named them Clara and Rose, names Jasmine had carried in her heart, vows to the daughters she'd fought for. The cabin felt alive now, warmed by the twins' cries, the fire's glow, the weight of survival. But the scratches returned, etched deeper into the door, sometimes in patterns. Lines, crosses, crude shapes that felt like threats. One night, Jasmine found a new drawing, a rough outline of two cradles, a knife mark slashing through them, carved with vicious intent. "He's not just watching," she said, clutching Clara and Rose, her voice shaking, her body trembling with rage and fear. "He wants us gone." Calvin's face hardened, his hand tightening around his knife, his eyes dark with resolve. "He'll have to go through me," he said, his tone cold, unyielding. She nodded, but fear stayed, a shadow that lingered even in the daylight, creeping into her dreams, a reminder of the man who'd tried to break her. Weeks passed, and Jasmine grew stronger, her body healing, her heart finding rhythm with Clara and Rose's soft breaths. She'd survived so much, hunger that left her dizzy, cold that numbed her bones, pains that nearly broke her, Rafe's betrayal that cut deeper than any blade. She began writing in her notebook, pages filling with dreams for her daughters, teaching them to sing, to plant seeds, to stand tall like she had. Calvin stayed, his presence a quiet anchor, cooking meals, fixing leaks, sanding the cradle until it rocked smoothly for two. He told her stories of the prairie, of birds that refused to migrate, of rivers that carved paths through stone, of stars that burned brighter in winter. His voice was gentle, never pitying, and Jasmine found herself listening, really listening, to the man who hadn't left. She watched him when he wasn't looking, his steady hands, his kind eyes, the lines of grief that deepened when he thought no one saw. He was a man who carried loss, but he carried hope, too, in the way he worked, the way he stayed. One afternoon, Jasmine sat by the fire, Clara and Rose asleep in her arms, her notebook open on her lap. She wrote a single word, home, and paused, her pen hovering, her heart heavy with the weight of survival. Calvin was outside, splitting wood, his axe ringing in the cold air. She watched him through the window, his breath misting, his movements sure, his strength a quiet promise. He told her little about himself, but she felt his story in the way he moved, the way he cared. When he came inside, snow dusting his shoulders, she offered him tea, her voice soft. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked, her eyes on the fire, her hands stroking Rose's tiny head. He took the cup, his fingers brushing hers, lingering a moment. "Thought about it," he said, his voice low, warm, "but some things are worth staying for." Her heart skipped, and she looked at him, really looked, seeing the man beneath the grief, the strength beneath the quiet. "I'm glad you stayed," she said, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes meeting his. He smiled, small but real, his eyes soft. "So am I," he said, and the silence between them was warm, full of unspoken trust. Another night brought a new sound, not scratches or tapping, but a low, guttural growl, like a man's voice muffled by the storm, circling the cabin. Jasmine woke, her heart racing, clutching Clara and Rose, their tiny bodies warm against her. Calvin was already by the door, lantern in hand, his knife gleaming, his face set with resolve. "Stay there," he said, his voice low, urgent. He stepped outside, the cold rushing in, the door creaking shut. Jasmine held her breath, her eyes fixed on the window, her hands trembling as she held her daughters, her mind racing with fear. The growling stopped, but the silence was heavy, oppressive, like the air before a lightning strike. She imagined Rafe out there, his eyes wild, his blade ready, waiting to claim what he'd abandoned. When Calvin returned, his face was pale, his breath quick, his coat dusted with snow. "No one," he said, but his hand trembled as he barred the door, his eyes troubled. "Just more marks." He showed her, a cluster of scratches, forming a crude outline of two figures, slashed through with a knife, carved with malice. "He's not giving up," Jasmine said, her voice shaking, her fingers tightening around her daughters, her heart pounding with rage. Calvin sat beside her, his presence steadying, his hand resting near hers. "He can try," he said, his voice hard. "He won't take you." The next day, Jasmine walked the cabin's small space, Clara and Rose in a sling against her chest, their tiny breaths a rhythm she clung to. She traced the walls with her fingers, memorizing the cracks, the knots in the wood, claiming the space as hers, a fortress she defended with her body and will. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting for her daughters, for a future she'd build with her own hands. Calvin watched her sometimes, his eyes soft, and she felt seen, not as a victim, but as a woman who'd fought starvation, cold, and betrayal to bring her twins into the world. She began to trust the warmth, the meals, the quiet rhythm of their days, but the fear of Rafe lingered, a weight she couldn't shake. She kept the knife close, practicing its grip when Calvin wasn't looking, her hands steady, her resolve unbreakable. One evening, Jasmine found another mark on the door, a crude drawing of two tiny figures, stick-thin, with slashes across their chests, carved with a knife's vicious point. Her heart sank, the image burning into her mind, her hands trembling with rage and fear. "He's not stopping," she said, showing Calvin, her voice trembling, her eyes blazing. He studied it, his jaw tight, his fingers gripping the doorframe, his knuckles white. "He's trying to break you," he said, his tone hard, his eyes dark with anger. "But you're stronger than he knows." She swallowed, tears burning her eyes, her hands clutching the quilt. "I don't feel strong," she admitted, her voice small, raw. He met her gaze, his eyes steady, warm. You're still here, he said. You survived him, the cold, everything. That's strength. She nodded, clinging to his words, her heart pounding with the will to protect her daughters. But the drawing stayed with her, a shadow in her mind, a threat she couldn't ignore. That night, the door rattled, not from wind but from force, a series of heavy thuds that shook the frame, loud and relentless, like a battering ram. Jasmine gasped, clutching Clara and Rose, her heart pounding, her body trembling with fear and rage. Calvin grabbed his knife, motioning her to hide behind the bed, his eyes sharp in the firelight, his body tense, ready. Stay there, he said, his voice low, fierce. He flung the door open, lantern raised, the light cutting through the swirling snow, his breath misting in the cold. Rafe stood there, taller than she remembered, his eyes wild, bloodshot, a long blade in one hand, a hatchet in the other, his breath sour with whiskey, his face twisted with rage. They're mine, he roared, stepping forward, his voice slurred but dangerous, his blade gleaming in the lantern's glow. The brats and the woman mine? Calvin blocked the doorway, his stance solid, his knife raised, his voice cold as ice. She's no one's but her own, he said, his eyes locked on Rafe, unyielding. And those girls are hers. Leave, or you won't walk away. Rafe laughed, a harsh, guttural sound, and lunged, his knife slashing toward Calvin's chest, the hatchet swinging in a wide arc. Calvin dodged, quick and steady, grabbing Rafe's wrist and twisting, the knife clattering into the snow. But Rafe was fast, swinging the hatchet with a snarl, the blade grazing Calvin's arm, blood seeping through his sleeve. Jasmine screamed, clutching her twins, her heart racing, but Calvin didn't falter. He tackled Rafe, slamming him into the doorframe, the wood splintering under the impact, their bodies locked in a brutal struggle. Rafe's hatchet swung again, narrowly missing Calvin's head, embedding in the wall with a thud. Calvin drove his knee into Rafe's stomach, knocking the wind from him, and wrenched the hatchet free, tossing it into the snow. Rafe roared, his fists pounding Calvin's chest, his nails clawing at his face, drawing blood. But Calvin was relentless, his knife pressed to Rafe's throat, his voice low, deadly. Last chance, he growled. Leave, or you're done. Rafe shoved Calvin back, breaking free, and stumbled into the snow, his eyes burning with rage, his breath heaving. You think you can keep them? He spat, grabbing a rock from the ground, hurling at the window, the glass shattering, cold rushing in. Jasmine ducked, shielding Clara and Rose, her heart pounding, her hands trembling but gripping the knife she'd hidden. Rafe lunged again, this time toward the door, his hands clawing at the frame, his voice a snarl. I'll take him, you hear me? They're mine. Calvin met him head on, his fist connecting with Rafe's jaw, a crack echoing in the night, sending Rafe sprawling into the snow, blood dripping from his mouth. Jasmine stood, her twins in one arm, her knife in the other, her voice steady despite the fear. You left us to die, she said, her eyes blazing, her body shaking with the strength she'd built through survival. You don't get to claim us now. Rafe scrambled to his feet, his eyes wild, but Calvin stepped Mexico, knife raised, his presence a wall between Rafe and the cabin. Go, Calvin said, his voice cold, final. Or I end this. Rafe cursed, his voice a drunken slur, and stumbled into the dark, his shouts swallowed by the storm, his figure fading into the white. Calvin barred the door, his hands shaking, blood dripping from his arm, his face scratched and bruised, his breath quick. Jasmine rushed to him, setting Clara and Rose in the cradle, her hands trembling as she tore a strip from her quilt to bind his wound. You're hurt, she whispered, her voice breaking, her eyes searching his. I'm fine, he said, his voice steady despite the pain, his hand covering hers, warm and grounding. He's gone. She shook her head, tears spilling, her heart pounding with fear and gratitude. He'll come back, she said, her voice trembling, her hands clutching his. Calvin met her gaze, his eyes steady, fierce. Not if I'm here, he said, his tone unyielding, protective. She looked at him, really looked. The blood on his face, the strength in his eyes, the man who'd fought for her and her daughters. "Why do you stay?" she asked, her voice soft, vulnerable, her heart raw. He touched her cheek, his fingers gentle, his eyes warm in the firelight. "Because you're worth fighting for," he said. "You and Clara and Rose." Her throat tightened, tears spilling, not from fear but from something deeper, trust, hope, the possibility of a future. "I'm scared to trust again," she said, her voice breaking, her eyes locked on his. "So am I," he said, his voice soft, honest, his hand still on hers. "But we're here, aren't we?" The next morning, Jasmine stood by the cradle, rocking Clara and Rose gently, their tiny faces peaceful in sleep, their breaths a quiet rhythm. The scratches had stopped, but the air felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. Calvin cleaned his knife by the fire, his arm bandaged, his face bruised but calm, his movements precise. "You ever lose someone?" she asked, her voice hesitant, her hand stroking Clara's soft hair. He paused, staring into the flames, his face tightening. "My wife, Marianne," he said, his voice low, steady but heavy. "My son, Jacob. They died in childbirth years ago." He swallowed, his eyes far away, his hands stilling. "I couldn't save them." Jasmine stepped closer, Rose in her arms, her heart aching for him, her own survival mirrored in his grief. "You saved us," she said, her voice soft but sure, her eyes meeting his. He shook his head, a faint smile breaking through the grief, his eyes warm. "You saved yourself," he said. "I just stayed." She touched his arm, her fingers lingering, the touch warm, grounding. "That's what mattered," she said, her voice steady, a quiet understanding passing between them. Days turned to weeks, and spring crept through the snow, green blades piercing the earth, stubborn and alive, a mirror of Jasmine's own resilience. She walked with Clara and Rose in a sling, singing lullabies her mother once sang, the words soft and familiar, carrying memories of warmth through the cold. Calvin built a small fence for a garden, his hands steady as he drove posts into the thawing ground, his shirt sleeves rolled up, sweat beading on his brow despite the chill. Jasmine spoke of planting turnips, potatoes, maybe carrots, simple things, but the idea of a harvest, of a future, made her voice tremble with something like joy, a testament to her survival. Calvin nodded, promising to get seeds from town, his eyes soft as he listened, his presence a quiet promise. They stood together one evening, watching the land stretch out, the sky pale blue above the hills, the air alive with the promise of change. "I don't know what's next," Jasmine said, her voice soft, her hand resting on Clara's head, Rose's tiny hand gripping her finger. "You don't have to," Calvin said, his tone gentle, his eyes on the horizon, his shoulder brushing hers. "You're already enough." Jasmine began to dream again, not of escape, but of staying, of roots, of a life built from the ashes of what she'd lost. She wrote more in her notebook, pages filling with hopes for Clara and Rose. Names like River or Dawn, moments like the first time they'd see the prairie in full bloom. Promises like teaching them to read by the fire, to fight like she had. She'd survived hunger that left her body trembling, cold that froze her breath, pains that nearly broke her, and Rafe's betrayal that tried to steal her spirit. Each word she wrote was a victory, a proof of her strength. She showed Calvin one entry, her handwriting small but steady. "You are my fight, my heart, my home." He read it silently, his fingers tracing the words, his face soft, unguarded, his eyes shining with quiet pride. "They're lucky to have you," he said, his voice low, warm, his hand resting near hers. Jasmine smiled, her heart full, heavy with love. "We're lucky to have you," she said, her voice soft but sure, her eyes meeting his, a bond forged in survival. One day, Jasmine rode to town alone, Clara and Rose tucked against her chest, the horse's hooves steady on the familiar path, her body stronger now, but still marked by the battle she'd fought. She bought cloth for dresses, a children's book with bright pictures, 2 silver rattles she didn't need, but wanted, their soft chimes making her twins gurgle with delight. Townsfolk stared, their whispers trailing her like smoke, their eyes flicking to the twins, to her face, to the strength in her posture, the woman who'd survived what they couldn't imagine. Rafe leaned against the saloon, thinner, his face rough with stubble, his eyes hollow, his hands twitching. "Those my kids," he called, stepping toward her, his voice rough, unsteady, his breath sour with whiskey. She faced him, her back straight, her gaze unflinching, her hands steady despite the fear that flickered in her chest. "They're mine," she said, her voice clear, strong, forged in survival. "You left us to die." He scowled, taking another step, his hand twitching like he might grab her, his eyes burning with rage. "You're still my wife," he said, his tone sharp, menacing. "No," she said, her eyes blazing, her voice steady, her strength a shield. "I was your prisoner. I'm free now." He blinked, stunned, his mouth opening but no words coming, his hands falling to his sides. She mounted the horse, her movements sure, her twins safe against her, and rode off, head high, the weight of his gaze fading behind her, powerless against the woman she'd become. Back at the cabin, Calvin met her at the door, taking Clara and Rose gently, his hands brushing hers, lingering a moment, his touch warm, grounding. His eyes held a quiet pride, a warmth that made her chest ache, a recognition of her strength. "You did good," he said, his voice soft but sure, his smile small but real. She swallowed, her heart warm, full, her survival mirrored in his gaze. "I went for me," she said, her voice steady, proud, her eyes meeting his. He nodded, his smile deepening, his eyes shining with respect. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone careful, his eyes searching hers, his voice soft but sure. "There's a clinic in town, a house, a garden, a school nearby, a life. I want you there with me." Her heart raced, fear and hope tangling, her breath catching, her hands tightening around her twins. "I don't need saving," she said, her voice firm, her eyes steady, her strength hard-won. "I'm not saving you," he said, his gaze unwavering, honest, his hand reaching for hers, warm and steady. "I'm asking you to stay." She looked at Clara and Rose, their tiny faces peaceful, their lives a testament to her fight, then at Calvin, his face open, vulnerable, strong. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice trembling, raw, her heart laid bare. "Me too," he said, his voice soft, his hands squeezing hers, his eyes locked on hers. "But we're here." That night, Jasmine sat by the fire, Clara and Rose asleep in her arms, their soft breaths a quiet rhythm, a song of survival. Calvin hummed a low tune, steady and warm, the sound filling the room like a promise, his voice a comfort she'd come to rely on. She leaned closer, their shoulders touching, the silence between them not empty but full of trust, of possibility, of a future they could build together. The scratches hadn't returned, and the wind was just wind now, soft against the windows, the storm of memory. Outside, the prairie stirred, alive with the promise of spring, wild grasses pushing through the melting snow, patches of earth welcoming the sun, a mirror of Jasmine's own resilience. Inside, something grew, quiet, real, like roots finding soil after a long, cold winter. Jasmine closed her eyes, not dreaming of what could be, but resting in what was, the man who saw her, the daughter she'd fought for, the life she'd carved from the ashes of betrayal, hunger, and pain. Moved by Jasmine's fight for Clara and Rose? Subscribe now to dive into more stories of unbreakable courage, survival, and hope in the wild prairie. Don't miss the next tale of strength and heart. Join our community and let these stories light your way through every storm.